Hello and welcome to another Dominion 6 Nation overview. Before we begin, I'm happy to announce that memberships have opened up for the channel, so consider having a look if you want to have more input on what videos come out next. In this episode we'll be covering Early Age Mictlan, the Reign of Blood. A fan favourite nation due to their national access to blood, and a lot of it, strong sacreds, and unique mechanics which make it perfect for a Hellbless. They are solidly based on the ancient Aztecs and take the idea of sacrifice to a new level. They are primarily a human nation, with strengths and weaknesses that do come along with that, but they have good access to additional demon troops and commanders. They have a fairly basic troop roster, but they have access to powerful sacreds, with some not restricted to just being capital only. On top of that, they have a good selection of mages, all of whom are quite useful and will all be used in your games. They have access to a few magic paths and pretty deep access in combat thanks to both astral communions and sabbaths, and having both astral and blood access for the late game is pretty nice. The Dominion is slightly different from normal Dominions as it is only spread by your Pretender, Prophet and Blood sacrifices. More on this later. They get +1 to their Turmoil and Heat limit, and they do get an additional +3 Bless points for free in Pretender design. As far as their infrastructure goes, their fortifications are basic, but still give you 2 commander points a turn. All of your units have inbuilt forest survival, which helps their map movement in between forests. Now, Mictlan can get great use out of communions. If you haven't already, I'd recommend watching my 2 deep dives on communions to get a better idea of this topic. I'll link the first part in the description. The same also goes for blood hunting for the use of blood spells. Again, I'll link that in the description. Additionally, a lot of the information being used in this is being taken from the Dominion 6 Mod Inspector to help display information a little more clearly. A link to that can also be found in the description. Let's start by going over your troops. Your basic troops really aren't the best of the age, not by a long shot. Overall, Mictlan is let down by the equipment that its troops have. They're mostly armed with stone weaponry and hide armour, with the elites, in quotation, having access to copper equipment, not the worst but far from the best. You don't have any national access to bows, only slings and javelins, so your troops can suffer in archer-to-archer duels. The main advantage you have is that your basic troops are fairly cheap and easy to mass. First of all, let's talk about slaves. Slaves can be levied by your priest kings or tribal kings by the levy slave action. More on that later. Slaves have poor stats and equipment, only using a stone spear with no armour, and have a terrible morale of 6. You can use them with taskmasters to increase their morale, and they make for fairly inexpensive chaff frontlines and patrollers, though they still have a small amount of upkeep, unlike other patrollers like wolves. Still, they can be useful as they're pretty easy to mass. Moving on, let's talk about your warriors. Now these come in 4 different varieties. They all cost the same in terms of gold and recruitment points. The only difference comes from their resource cost, and that's due to their slightly different armament. Let's start with the cheapest one. These warriors come with a stone spear, a sling, and a hide shield. That's it. They have no other armour at all. They only cost 1 resource each, so you'll never be limited by resources to recruit them, and they have basic stats, except for the protection of 0. These warriors will be pretty much killed by any hit, bar potentially a Hoburg punch, but even then that's down to dice rolls. So what's the benefit of these troops? Well, they're resource cheap, so they can be fairly easy to mass in a pinch. All of them have a sling, so they can contribute at least some range damage to a fight, and also they have a hide shield to help protect them against some missile fire. Massing these guys into large squads will also affect the battle's AI's targeting due to the mass of low protection units, meaning that ranged enemy attackers will actually try and prioritize them over other units. Doesn't work all the time, but can work to quite good effect. This is great for Mictlan, as reducing the number of casualties you take from range fire for your more important sacreds and summons is amazing. These guys can easily be replaced with some gold cost. Your summons and sacreds are either more costly or need gems or blood slaves to get. Your next warrior is an upgraded version of the one before. Same offensive equipment and stats, but they actually do have some armour now, which is nice. Unless you've tanked your order and productivity scales, you'll get these guys probably more than the unarmoured version. 10 protection can at least do something in some small archer duels, and they still have the hide shield to help as well. The fact they all have slings as well makes them slightly more useful with some combinations you can do with your mages as well. More on that later. Next up we have the warriors with spears and javelins. They have the same costs and stats as the previous warrior, but instead of a sling they have a javelin. They can be more useful when it comes to fighting off larger enemies due to the javelin's inbuilt damage, but they are still a little bit meh in melee. Finally, you have your most elite, in quotations, warrior. These guys cost 14 resources, so double your previous option. And they are armed with a mace and a javelin. But they have copper armor, which does give them protection of 12, which isn't great, but isn't completely terrible. They do more damage than the spears with their maces, and the bludgeoning damage is useful for things like undead. But they're slightly slower in both combat and strategic map due to their armor encumbrance. So which of these warriors do you really want to use? Well, it really depends on what you want your troops to do. Are you using them as arrow catchers for your more important troops? Get the unarmored version, or just use slaves. Are they for archer duels? Then you probably want to get the armored slingers, the guys we talked about second. If you're going for off-center flanking attacks, then you can get either the third guys or the fourth guys, as they make pretty decent troops. Just remember the fourth guys are a little bit slower. If you need something to shore up your front line, again, use one of the latter two troops. Their javelins will be more effective against the enemy that way, and they can hold for a little bit at least. Next troop we have is the Moon Warrior, who are more costly than your warriors in terms of both gold and resources and recruitment points. For this increase in cost, you have a pretty decent weapon for a base troop, and slightly better stats, but they do not have a shield. In previous versions of the minions, the Moon Warriors were a late game option for when you were casting darkness in order to work with your other summons, as they have partial dark vision to offset the penalties. There's more of a reason in Dominion 6 to use these guys because of the inclusion of the cave layer. Having national access to troops with partial dark vision to help you expand into the underground is actually a pretty useful niche for these to have, especially seeing as they're not capital only. Bear in mind as well that they do actually have better magic resistance and morale than your basic troops too. The Feathered Warrior is like the final version of your warrior in terms of armament, but they cost far more in both gold, resources, and recruitment points. For this, however, you get access to a standard bearer, which is very useful for increasing the morale of your troops. Stick a few of these in a squad and they'll help be there for longer. Alright, let's start talking about your sacreds. These are the real meat on your bones. The first two are capital only, so we'll speak of them first. So the Eagle Warrior is a dual-wielding sacred troop that has pretty poor protection, but decent attack skill with both of their weapons. Their 2 attacks per unit mean you actually get quite good attack density out of them if you fill up a square with them. 6 attacks in total per full square. Pretty nice. The main benefit you get out of them, however, is that they can be blessed as they are sacred. So they'll take whatever bless you have for them. Additionally, when they are blessed, they are also able to fly. This is an absolute game changer for them. Now you have recruitable, flying sacreds to do some cheeky attack rear shenanigans in battle. Do note that they only fly when they're blessed, so they don't have access to flying when it comes to map movement. When flying, they also get a charge bonus on their lance to do a little bit of extra damage on the first lance strike. Because of their high attack density, these guys can make really good shock troops and are actually quite useful for expanding in the early game. The Sun Warrior is a bettered armoured and defensive sacred armed with a hatchet. These guys are decent at doing quite a lot of slashing damage when geared for it with a stronger bless. They have higher strength than your other troops, and have decent enough hit points for a human, and they actually have pretty high morale. They are capital only, however, and they have niche uses in comparison to your Eagle Warriors, so it's tough to recommend them over your Eagles. You can find a use for these, however, if you're going up against a lot of fire damage. This brings us on to your final recruitable sacred, the Jaguar Warrior. This sacred is recruitable in any fortification Mictlan has, not just their capital, making them the easiest of the 3 sacreds to mass. They have alright stats, except for their protection, and they have a very highly damaging attack, though it is less accurate than the Sun Warrior. When these guys are blessed, on top of whatever bless you have given them, these Jaguar Warriors will also turn to Were-Jaggers when they are wounded. This gives you a sacred with a reasonable 2 pools of HP, and in Were-Jaguar form they get 3 attacks. 2 with their claws and 1 with their bite. When in their Were-Jaguar form, they go from a size 3 to a size 4, so you'll only fit 2 of them in a square rather than the previous 3. This means if all your troops are transformed, then you're getting about 6 attacks from 1 square, and that is unbuffed. These Jaguar forms do have poorer protection than their base form, but more HP and higher strength, as well as better attack skill for their 3 attacks. These sacreds are the poster child of Early Age Mictlan, at least in previous versions. With a proper bless, they can be quite hard to deal with, deal a lot of damage, and actually tank a fair amount. Alright, let's move on to commanders. So first of all, you have a basic scout. Decent enough, but probably not something you want to use fortification turns for if you can help it. If you can find independent scouts, just recruit them instead. Next up, we have the Tribal King, who's your national commander. He has basic commander stats with OK equipment, and he is a good leader. So he can lead 100 men, and he has access to advanced formations. He's also sacred, so he will count towards your sacred recruitment limit for the turn, so bear that in mind when you're recruiting him. He's also a taskmaster, and he can levy slaves for you to use in your armies as a quick frontline screen. Overall, a decent enough commander. When you levy slaves, you take population away from the province that your commander is in. Doing so will also increase the unrest of the province, which will affect your income for the next turn. So be careful of which provinces you try and get slaves in. Having 5 guys getting slaves in your capital is a sure way to bankrupt yourself. Now let's move on to your mages. Your first mage is the Mictlan Priest, a Blood 1, Holy 1, Sacred Mage, who has a 10% chance for a +1 in Fire, Water, Astral, or Nature. These are one of the workhorses for your nation. They're sacred, so their upkeep is pretty low, 36 gold per year, and at a starting cost of only 90 gold, that's actually quite a steal. They cost 0.42 gold per research point they spend for a year researching. Not quite Gala tier, but still very, very good for their gold efficiency for research. Not only this, but they are also a blood mage, so they can be quite useful in your blood searching. Their effectiveness has been a bit less in Dominion 6 due to the changes in blood hunting. They are, however, still better than commanders with no blood skill, and given their relatively low cost for it, they're still pretty effective blood hunters. Because of their Blood 1 as well, they can obviously enter Sabbaths, either as masters or slaves, to improve their casting abilities or to help empower others. Random paths that you get will also add additional paths to your Sabbaths, which you can use to then cast other spells within your Sabbaths in a pinch. Obviously don't rely on it because it's a fairly low chance. The next mage we have access to is the Tlahuelpuchi, which is another workhorse for your nation, but in a different way. They have Astral 1 and Nature 2 as base, with a random of 10% chance of +1 in Astral, Death, Nature, or Blood. Due to the way communions work in Dominion 6 now, Sabbaths and Astral communions are now separate. They allow you access to some independent communion plays, especially when you've got the two on the same battlefield. This means that your communion masters and your Astral communion will not be fatiguing out your blood slaves like what happened in previous dominions. The Tlahuelpuchi are also shape changers, being able to turn into turkeys, which gives them flying movement and another form in which to use HP due to the shape changer function. These guys are your army buffers. They like to cast big nature spells like Relief, Howl, Wooden Army, Animate Forest, or making your army go berserk. You can also use these as flying response squads, and later in the game you can use them as little flying raiders with spells like Creeping Doom. Just bear in mind when you're kitting them out, when they're in turkey form, they only get the benefit of miscellaneous slots, and in the future, if I refer to something as a turkey, I'm talking about these guys. Now we move on to your capital only mages. You have 4 to choose from, and they're all useful for different circumstances. So your capital will be focused on making them for most of the game. Fortunately, none of them are slow to recruit. The first of these is the Rain Priest, a Water, Blood, and Holy 2 Sacred. They're quite useful for summoning things like Frost Fiends and Ice Devils with some boosters, as well as buffing your troops with things like Gift of Formlessness and Quickness, and especially debuffing your enemies with things like Slow. Additionally, if you go Cold Scales Mictlan, more of that in the scale section, or if you're fighting a cold nation, they're very useful for casting things like Cold Resistance for your troops. As with all of your capital priests, they can also join Sabbaths. Next up we have the Moon Priest, an Astral, Blood, and Holy 2 mage who is also sacred, and they do also have Dark Vision, which is nice I guess. These mages can also command the most magical units out of all of your national mages. Because of their past, they can join either your Astral Communions or your Blood Sabbaths. In Sabbaths, they're very useful for casting Power of the Spheres in order to help boost up your slave blood paths to help reduce their fatigue gain. Use these guys to cast big spells like Anti-Magic, Will of the Fates, or Doom to sway large battle, or summon a bunch of horrors because it's funny. They're also an easy way to cast Bind Tzitzimitl, one of your summons. Next we have the Priest King, who are Nature, Blood, and Holy 2 Sacred Mages. They're your best leaders you have access to via recruitment. With a nice morale bonus and Taskmaster, they can actually make your slaves less likely to run away in combat. He can also levy slaves himself as well, but you maybe want to use your mage turn for something different. He's useful as another way to cast your big nature spells like the Tlahuelpuchi, or for forging blood booster items. He can also give you access to crossbreeding or awakening dark vines for more units, and in battle he can cast Purify Blood to give your whole army poison resistance. Finally, they can cast Blood Fecundity out of the gate, which can give you a lot more options when it comes to your scales and blood hunting. More on that later. Your final capital only mage is the High Priest of the Sun, who are Blood and Holy 3 and Fire 2. and obviously they are sacred. They're okay leaders, but they are old-aged, but that can be fixed with Rejuvenate later into the research tree. These guys are pretty important to your war effort for their ability to summon Jaguar Fiends, or Ozelotl, one of your good sacred units. Additionally, they can cast Hellfire right out of the bat. They can summon Devils and Archdevils with some boosters, and let you get off some nice fire spells, Fire Resistance, Flaming Arrows, Gift of the Furies, and most of the fire evocations thanks to Phoenix power. They're also strong priests, being able to cast Smite out of the gate and claim thrones for your god. Okay, that's recruitable units. Now on to Mictlan's summons, which you have a lot of, so get ready. You have blood summons and also non-blood summons. We'll go through the non-blood summons first. If you want to skip over this section, remember that there's the timeline at the bottom of the video so you can find what you want to see. So, first off we have the Jaguar Toads. At Conjuration 1, requiring Nature and Holy 1 for 2 Nature Gems for 3 Toads. The Toads themselves are size 4 Tramplers, with good HP and otherwise poor stats, and a Poison Spit and Claw attack as well, as plenty of poison resistance, and they also have Poisonous Skin that causes their enemies to become immobile. An interesting summon in that they're Tramplers, but they are also undisciplined, and they have poor protection, so they'll likely die. They're also really only summonable by Priest Kings or Mictlan Priests with a Nature random, so they're quite hard to get, and they don't have the best Mage turn and Gem return by only getting 3 Toads. They're useful in a pinch, but not something to write home about. If you get Woodhenge Druids as an independent, they can summon them though as well. They're also pretty slow in combat, only having combat speed of 6, so they're going to have a hard time getting into combat and might just die to Archer Fire before that. Summon Jaguars is a Nature 2, Holy 1 ritual at Conjuration 3 that costs a whopping 20 Nature Gems, but it does summon 25 Sacred Jaguars, which have 2 attacks each, and they are stealthy, with decent HP and attack skill. Because of their speed, with a decent bless, they can make fairly effective flankers, though they are undisciplined. If you can cast any of your buffing nature spells on them to improve their attack or morale further, they can be pretty scary animal to fight. At Conjuration level 4 we have the Summon Jade Serpents, which is a Water 2 spell, costing 3 Water Gems, and for that you get 2 Jade Serpents. These are size 8 sacks of HP with an OK Fang attack that does additional death poison if it does damage. They also act as standard bearers. They can only be summoned by your Rain Priests without independent mages, but they are again sacred and amphibious, so this is a potential choice to back up your Rain Priests if you want to get under the water. They aren't the best at clearing chaff, but they can be an OK anti-thug due to their death poison if they can get through their defences. Summon Monster Toad is a Conjuration 5 spell needing 2 nature, and it costs 1 nature gem for a single Monster Toad. These are size 8 tramplers that also have a poison cloud around them, which can be dangerous to your own troops as well, so do watch out. They have a lot of HP, so with a supporting bless they can be actually quite difficult to bring down, and they can be pretty OK tramplers. As they only cost 1 nature gem for one of these toads, they're actually a pretty good deal all things considered if you're thinking about gem efficiency. And you don't need a holy level, unlike the Jaguar Toads, so they can actually be summoned by your Nahuali, meaning you can get quite a few of these per turn later into the game. If you're against foes without poison resistance, having a few of these with some decent buffs to help them last can do a lot of damage in a battle between their poison cloud and their trampling. Contact Couatl is a Conjuration 6 spell needing Nature and Astral 1 that costs 40 Nature Gems, which summons a Couatl commander. They have Astral and Nature 3 and Holy 2, and they are sacred on top of being able to fly, and they are a good leader. They aren't your traditional raiders in a sense, and they are quite expensive, but they do give you high astral and nature access, and can actually make a pretty good communion slave for your Nahuals, given their high pass to help reduce fatigue. Having these guys with a bunch of flying turkeys can make a pretty rapid strike force for whenever you need big spells on the battle. Finally, for your national non-blood summons, there's the Summon Tlaloque, a Conjuration 7 spell that needs water level 4 and costs 60 water gems. When cast, it will summon one of the 4 Tlaloque. The East is Water 4, Nature 2, Blood 3, and Holy 3. The North, Air 2, Water 2, Blood 3, and Holy 3. The South, Fire 2, Water 4, Blood and Holy 3. And the Tlaloque of the West is Water 4, Death 2, and Blood and Holy 3. Of these options, probably the West and the North are the most useful, both giving you access to paths you don't normally have from your national recruits. The south one also lets you forge rune smashers to help your magical penetration for your big spells. The issue is that when you cast the spell, the one that you get is random, so you'll just have to deal with what you've been given. Do remember as well that all of them are very powerful water casters and let you contest for elemental queens of water should you wish to. And all of them can also bind ice devils into your service. They are quite costly in water gems, though if you have a stockpile of them, they're certainly an option to use, and when they're on the battlefield, they will cause rain to fall automatically. Okay, now on to blood summons. All of these summons have the advantage in that they cost blood slaves in order to cast rather than magical gems. This means the number of slaves you need might sound quite high, but if you have a good blood economy as Mictlan, or rather you need to have a good one, you'll be able to summon these quite a bit. First of all, we have Bind Beast Bats. At blood level 2, that needs blood 1 and 8 blood slaves in order to summon 3 sacred beast bats. They're flying bats with admittedly bad protection, but otherwise they've got decent stats and a venomous fang that does fatigue damage as an additional effect. They've actually also got quite high magic resistance, which is good because they need it as they are demons and they can be banished. They're stealthy and blind, which makes them pretty good at taking provinces underground or fighting in darkness, as they will not take a penalty there. They're not exceptional units, but they're pretty cheap, and they also get your bless, plus every single one of your blood mages can summon them, so you can start pumping out a lot of these in a turn that you need to, say in like a siege defense. I wouldn't say your main summon, however. At blood level 4, we have Bind Jaguar Fiends, which needs blood and fire level 1 and 16 blood slaves for 3 Ozelotls. And you also have an additional later game spell at blood level 8 that needs blood 6, fire 2, and 40 blood slaves for 14 Ozelotls plus 1 for every additional level in blood. These are flying Jaguar demons that are sacred with a pretty good amount of HP and 3 attacks each. They are size 5 however, so you're only getting 2 of them per square. They've got pretty good base stats other than protection, but if you were to set them to, say, attack archers, they'll absolutely chew them up. Same with most basic commanders. They are demons, but again, they have decent magic resistance, and with their stats, they hold a bless very well. They are a little bit hard to summon, however, requiring your High Priest of the Sun to summon, but they're very much worth it if you can get your blood economy running enough to get several of these casts off per turn. At blood level 5, you have Contact the Civateteo, which needs blood and death 2, as well as 36 blood slaves. They have Holy 2 and Death and Blood 1 on a stealthy, ethereal chassis, with Fear, who can also reanimate undead. They're a little bit harder for you to summon as they require Death Pass, which you can only get on your Pretender, Onaqis, or one of your heroes, and they don't really break you into death that well, being Death 1 themselves. They can make okay thugs, however, due to their etherealness, and with a Skull Staff they can skelly spam against small province defense. They have also really good undead leadership, so they can be quite useful for leading your demon armies. At blood 6 you can bind the Tzitzimitl, which needs blood, an astral 2, and 10 blood slaves for just one of these star demons. These star demons are sacred flying units with 2 melee attacks and a ranged stellar bolt, which has a pretty far range at 55 and does armor negating magic damage, though an MR check can reduce this to half. These guys are both scary as flying attackers or as ranged forces. Their stellar bolt has long range and does damage equal to their strength, so if you're going to buff their strength through a bless or other means, they can do some really good damage. They are a little bit hard to mass as they require your Moon Priest in order to do it, but they can be scary to fight. The only thing they really lack is protection. Also at blood 6 you can contact the Tlahuelpuchi, which needs blood 3 and 42 blood slaves. For this you get a blood 2, Death and Nature 1 mage that can fly, shape change into a dog, and is also stealthy and an assassin. They're interesting units and they have okay stats. Their magic pass are okay if you want to use them as assassins, but they're not really useful other than that. You will find use of them as assassins, but they'll probably need a little bit of gear to do their job due to their lacking in protection. In dog form, they have a higher stealthiness than normal though, and you could use them as expensive scouts if you wanted to, but there's probably better use for your blood slaves. Bear in mind though that if they are assassinating, they have pretty good patience in their Tlahuelpuchi form, so it'll mean less bodyguards will be defending their target. Finally at blood 7 you can contact Onaqui, which needs blood 4 and 101 blood slaves. For this, you get a flying, stealthy demon sacred commander with Blood 3, Death 2, Nature and Holy 1, with an 100% chance for a +1 random in either Fire, Death, Nature, or Blood. These guys are what reliably breaks you into death, having base Death 2 and also a chance of getting a Death 3. They also free spawn beast bats within your dominion, allowing you to get quite a few of them, and they also come with 2 beast bats as a retinue. If you get a fire random, they can also help you summon more Ozelotls. They also make very effective raiders and thugs, thanks to their paths with just a little bit of gear, but they're also very good at leading your armies. A very strong and versatile summon that actually makes rushing for Blood 7 from the start not the worst option as a game for Mictlan. Let's move on to Mictlan's heroes. We only have 2 of them. Both of them are very good, however, and they do make taking Misfortune a bit more painful to take as Mictlan, as you really like to get both of them for the magic diversity. The first is the King of Legends, a holy, death and blood 3 undead mage who can also reanimate skeletons. He has pretty great stats, but he does have an innate weakness to fire. He gives you some really good death access for your nation, which you otherwise won't have until you start summoning Onaqui, which is nice. It gives you access to big death spells and a Sabbath on the battlefield, and also additional forging opportunities. The Eagle Priest is a Air, Blood and Holy level 2 mage that's basically an upgraded Eagle Warrior. He can fly as base, he doesn't need to be blessed to do it, and he makes a good supporting commander for your armies. If you manage to get something out such as Wind Guide on your slings, it does increase their effectiveness quite a lot in battle, as does something like Arrow Fend, which is great on your not very well protected troops. Getting access to air does give you a lot more tactical flexibility on the battlefield, which you can use in battles you need to win. As for starting sites for Early Age Mictlan, you have 4, which give you a total of 1 Nature, 1 Water, 1 Astral Pearl, 3 Blood Slaves, and 2 Fire Gems. This is pretty good passive income. Pretty on par for the early age, but it does give you gem income in all the paths that you want. Especially useful as those 3 blood slaves from the start. It doesn't sound like much, but it'll pile up over your first year, and hopefully you'll be able to start blood hunting before the end of your first year as well. Alright, okay, so that's the units of the nation. So what kind of magic do you want to get? As always, all research is good, but Mictlan is really a nation that runs off of blood. Blood gives you access to your great national summons, really important battle magic, as well as Sabbaths. Help boost the paths of all your mages. Getting a good blood economy up early and running well is crucial for being able to get the most out of your blood research. That's not to say that the other schools of research aren't important. They are, especially if you cannot get a blood economy up and running. Let's go over some important spells that Mictlan want to work towards. So, let's talk about blood first of all. Sabbath Master and Sabbath Slave are crucial for getting the most out of your mages. All but one of your mages are blood mages, and they can all help each other in battle by going into Sabbaths if you need to cast higher level spells. Additionally, the same thing can be said about Thaumaturgy 1 for Communion Master Slaves if you want to use more of your Moon Priests and Turkeys. Bloodlust or Rush of Strength are both terrific spells for you. Quite a lot of your blood summons are demons, so they get the bonus to strength from Bloodlust at Blood 4. Rush of Strength does the same thing for you, but also affects all of your non-demon troops. Unfortunately, they don't both stack together. But getting +4 strength on your multi-attack sacred troops massively increases their damage. As I mentioned before, Jaguar Fiends are a great summon for you. With their 3 attacks each, they can absolutely murder normal troops. They're tankier than your Beast Bats or any of your recruitable Sacreds, and as they're Sacreds, they can take a bless really well with the chassis they have. Starting to summon these early means that you can get a critical mass of them that your enemies won't be able to deal with in your first or second war. Blood Fecundity is an optional spell, but it's still very useful depending on what scales you've taken. As you're blood hunting and reducing unrest, you will reduce the population in the province that you're in. Blood Fecundity can help reverse this by raising the growth level in that province by +2, and it only costs 10 blood slaves base, and it lasts 1 month. But you can increase the amount of time that it lasts by adding in additional blood slaves at a ratio of 1 month for 1 blood slave. So let's say you sacrifice 20 blood slaves, that's 10 additional, you get 10 months of additional growth. This is very useful for your main blood hunting provinces with high population to offset the losses. This means as well, you can go some death scales too as Mictlan to get you more points for your bless as you want to. We'll go on to that a little bit more later. Blood Rain is a great spell for reducing your enemy's morale by frightening them. Your troops don't have the best morale to start with, so reducing the enemies will level the playing field a bit. You can get that at blood level 6. Using something like Blood Rain, as well as something like Harm, or casting things like Fear or Terrify, can really start to make your enemy run pretty quickly. Even better if you have a Fear Bless. Onaqui, as we've said before, are another fantastic commander summon. They'll free spawn Sacreds, break you into death magic, and they are effective commanders, fighters, and mages. You can rush to get here, just make sure you have the 101 Blood Slaves by the time you do, otherwise you've wasted your research. Purify Blood is another great spell in order to give your whole army poison resistance, so your human troops and mages are less vulnerable to army wipes through foul vapors or enemies using poison arrow. Especially useful if you're using your monster toads as well, so you'll take a little bit less friendly fire, though positioning is probably a better way to avoid that. In non-blood spells, something like Ferocity is good to get if you're using a lot of your animals, such as your Jaguars. Giving them +2 attack skill will make them do a lot more with a multi-attack, and giving them +2 morale will also help. Gift of the Furies is basically the same thing as Ferocity, but it's for your non-animal units. Buffing up your Sacred's attack skill will again cause them to perform much better in battle. Even on your basic troops, it will make them perform better than they otherwise would, and they might actually be able to hold the line for a while. Flaming Arrows and Serpent Fang Arrows are good if you're using a lot of your cheap slinger units, your first 2 warriors. Being able to do additional damage with such an abundant troop choice means that you can fight more protected forces far easier, at least until something like Arrowfend comes up. Group Bark Skin is a fantastic spell. Your troops lack protection for the most part, so improving their natural protection can make them far more tanky. As you lack Earth Paths as Mictlan, this is the best you can do. Just be sure not to use this against fire damage nations due to the reduction in fire resistance. This also applies to any of the future spells that increase their effect, things like Wooden Army or Wooden Warriors. Astral Geyser is actually a good spell for your turkey communions to assist in fights. It has a large AoE magic damage, and it will also horror mark those it hits. This can be useful in combination of, say, calling horrors in with a Sabbath, if that's the way you want to go. Anti-magic is important later in the game. Buffing the magic resistance of your demons makes them much less likely to be killed by repeated banishments, which your enemies will bring to bear once the demon train leaves the station. Anything you can do to increase their magic resistance will increase their longevity quite a bit. Howl is another great option that you have with your turkey or priest kings and communions or sabbaths respectively. Summoning all this chaff will distract your enemies while your sacreds and troops do the work. This is especially useful if you know that your enemy is expecting you to, say, attack rear with your flyers, as these wolves will tie up those troops defending behind the enemy line. Obviously, this is not a limited list of spells that are useful to you in the game, but they are important ones to bump up your effectiveness in combat and some examples for you to work towards. Don't forget your other kind of spells like resistance buffs, elemental summons, and also being able to get something like construction research for forging items, which we'll go over in the next section. Now on to forging. Mictlan is not a normal forging nation. What I mean by that is they don't have access to any earth, so it means no easy hammer access. So that means you're paying full price for everything that you forge. You're also very strapped for mage turns when it comes between blood hunting and research to free up the mages for forging items. Once your blood economy ramps up, however, and you're starting to swim in blood slaves, that means that you can start forging blood items to help assist your mages when it comes to their other tasks. Early Age Mictlan has one national item, the Jade Knife. This item isn't a great weapon, but it does have an important function. It allows you to sacrifice up to 2 more blood sacrifices than your priest otherwise would when performing the blood sacrifice action. This is a very important tool for using to control your dominion as Early Age Mictlan, as your dominion does not spread except from your pretender or your prophet and from these blood sacrifices. You cannot preach your dominion as Early Age Mictlan. These knives will help keep your Mictlan priests more useful for keeping the enemy dominion at bay, if you want to. We'll go into a bit more detail on that later. So what about some other forging ideas? Well, let's talk about research boosters. The easiest one for you is probably the Imp Familiar. It only costs 5 blood slaves and increases your research by +3, making your Mictlan priests even more efficient. There are other easily accessed options you have, such as the homunculi through nature or lightless lanterns through fire. The lanterns are much more late game and you have a lot of research you want to prioritize. Not only that, but you probably want to be using your fire mages for summoning more Jaguar Fiends. Sanguine Dowsing Rods will kick your blood hunting up into high gear. They make the holder act as 1 blood level higher for the purposes of blood hunting. Giving these to your Mictlan priests makes them much more likely to find slaves, from a 40% chance to a 70% chance of finding them every single time. Once you get Construction 5, start handing these out, and your blood slave income will start to soar. The Heart of Life is a great, fairly cheap item to hand out to casters or to communion slaves. It gives it a super impressive 10 reinvigoration and also a little bit of poison resistance on the top, which is very useful. Any of the other hearts you have, you could also use, especially something like the Slave Heart, so your Sabbath slaves don't need to cast Sabbath Slave at the start of the battle. Do bear in mind though that it does apply a chest wound affliction to your units, which can hurt them a little bit, especially with your lower HP being humans. The Armour of Twisting Thorns is a great booster item, giving +1 to both nature and blood for your casters. Your Priest Kings especially love this, as they get the benefits from both, though the encumbrance isn't that great for their spell casting, so you should probably keep them back as ritual casters. Additional boosters are always fantastic when you need them, and you have fairly easy ability to forge the blood ones, as well as some of the nature ones, the Thistle Mace. The Rat Tail is an overlooked weapon in my mind, especially for nations that use slaves. It grants Taskmaster 1 to the wielder for improving the morale of your slaves, which is good for mixed armies. If you're only using slaves for a specific commander, consider giving them instead a Whip of Command for a total of +3 leadership for slaves. This makes them far less likely to run in battle, or not quite as often anyway. The Soul Contract and Lifelong Protection are both useful blood forges as well. While both are costly, 90 and 40 blood slaves apiece, you should be able to reach the point where you're getting enough blood slaves to forge these now and again, bearing in mind you will have other uses for them as well. Getting a free Devil Summon every turn on multiple researchers will add up quite quickly, and also the auto-summoning of imps in battle doesn't hurt anything at all. Finally, as a couple of forging examples, we have 2 more morale-increasing items, Horns of Valor and Crowns of Command. Giving your leaders inspirational will massively help your troops stay in the battle to gum up the enemy's lines as chaff or keep firing as slingers. All the while your sacreds will do the work of actually killing your enemies. Okay, from here we'll move into the game. But as I promised in Luce's Discord, I would show my recent family photos of us having a great time on holiday. Here we are at the beach, good old Biggie Goals here as well, and most people are having a good time. Most people. For Early Age Mictlan, the design screen is a very important one. Your selection of your God, Bless, and Scales is crucial for what your game is going to look like when you get into it. Speaking of your gods, you have access to the Aztec culture gods, which is a little limited, but there's still some good chassis to pick from, and a good variety of paths in all 4 of the Dominions categories. When it comes to your Dominion, you want to have a high Dominion strength so you can get a good amount of sacred production from your forts, and also for your Dominion strength against losing candles. As I touched on previously, your Dominion as Early Age Mictlan doesn't spread on its own like a regular Dominion does through temples. Your Pretender, Prophet, and Blood Sacrifices are the only way in order to spread your Dominion. This does open up a line of thought though. As Mictlan, you can take worse scales than normal because your Dominion doesn't automatically spread, so your surrounding provinces will not be affected as badly, but you do obviously still need your Dominion somewhere or else you're going to lose, so completely trashing your scales might not be the best idea, unless you can get your Dominion out of your capital. Hellblesses with horrific scales are also much harder to do now, just from the fact that, by default, you can only go up to either +2 or -2 in your scales. I'll give some examples of Hellblesses you can do with Pretenders later. This is just something for you to keep in mind. So when it comes to our scales, if we aren't thinking of microing our Dominion through sacrifices, then what does Mictlan want? Well, we probably do want a little bit of order. It helps our unrest go down, it gives us a little more money and resources, and most importantly, recruitment points, so we can get the most Jaguar warriors every turn out of every fort. Unfortunately, Mictlan has +1 turmoil to its scales, so we can only get +1 normally. If your god lets you get +2, great. Sloth in comparison is perfectly fine for Mictlan, unless you want to center your forces around your higher resource cost warriors or moon warriors. Between our cheaper warriors, summons, and our non-resource intensive Jaguar warriors, we really don't need that many resources, so going Sloth 1 or 2 is completely fine. When it comes to temperature scales, Mictlan likes to be a default of Heat 1. We can then go to either Heat 3 or Cold 1 as our maximum deviation. Due to the introduction of extreme scales, I'd actually suggest going Cold more if you want the points. If you're at Heat 3, that means in summer there's a chance you're going to be at Heat 4 in your Dominion, and that can lead to some fairly quick population decline in your provinces, which leads to less blood slaves and a sad Onaqui. Heat 2 is also fine as a half measure if you don't want to dip all the way into the cold for the reduced map movement, and so your temperature scales are not too bad for your cold-blooded units. You will get less design points for that, however. When it comes to growth or death, it really comes down to how much you want to micro your provinces in Dominion. If you don't want to do that at all, you can just go growth 1, call it a day. Or if you want to, just keep it neutral, save some points. If you do need the points, Dipping then into Death 1 or even 2 can be a way to do it. As for our important provinces in our dominion, we can use Blood Fecundity with our Priest Kings to help raise the growth level in that province by 2, which completely negates these death scales, or in the sense of Death 1, actually makes it Growth 1. This is a very powerful tactic to make sure that your fortifications don't lose out of their population, and by that, their gold and their recruitment points. As I mentioned previously, our heroes are actually quite good at increasing our magic diversity. If your pretender lacks air or death and you really want to get those paths, maybe avoid misfortune. Otherwise, what you take mostly comes down to your personal preferences and how many points you need at pretender design. Your lack of fortune tellers, however, as Mictlan, means you cannot easily offset misfortune scales, so do keep that in mind. Finally, for magic scales, with your efficient researchers, you do actually quite enjoy having the increased magic scale. This is only useful, mind you, if you're giving your dominion to your provinces, however. Drain does make your researchers less speedy researchers, but giving them research boosting items does offset this slightly. I wouldn't dip too much into either of them, however. Drain 2 will really hurt your early research, while Magic 2 is quite expensive when you could be spending your design points on other things. If you're going for like an etherealness, quickness bless, then Magic 2 is. As for whether you want your god awake, dormant, or imprisoned, well, that really depends on your bless. If you're going for a massive imprisoned non-incarnate bless, great, go imprisoned. Doesn't matter. If you have a bunch of incarnates, do not go imprisoned. If you go dormant with an incarnate heavy bless, you may find yourself struggling to expand in the early game due to your fairly lacking troops, other than your sacreds. But you can do it with small groups of eagle warriors on attack rear, backed up by an additional force of regular troops. If you've gone awake and you've got a bunch of incarnates, they can go full hog on sacred rushes with multiple expansion parties of Jaguars and priests, just wreaking havoc on independence every single turn. Now onto your paths and your bless. So Mictlan gets plus 3 bless points from the start, meaning that it can take more blesses than some other nations. Given your abundance of sacreds available to you, you want to take a fairly hard bless if you're able to. Specifically on Mictlan, just due to the amount of multi-attack sacreds you have, taking something like a weapon bless is actually not the worst thing in the world. Additionally, taking protection blesses on your fairly low protection troops does work, things like Stygian Flesh, Barkskin, or Hardskin. Out of these 3, I do personally prefer Stygian Flesh. The 10 invulnerability is quite nice, and while it is a little wasted once you start casting Barkskin yourself, it can make the difference in your early expansion and early wars, and when you have Barkskin, the better the 2 will be used for the protection. Barkskin has less of immediate effect, only giving you plus 7 instead of the invulnerability's 10, but it does mean you might save mage turns casting it later, and also it does work against magical weapons. Additionally for Mictlan, stat blesses for your sacreds are quite good. Attack skill and strength especially, due to their many attacks. Undying can also be quite useful for your Jaguar warriors, as they will turn into were Jaguars if they are wounded, but they can be killed outright without transformation from a big enough hit. So having an additional level of HP that they can go down to, turn into a were Jaguar, can help. Enchanted Blood is also a nice pickup for your humans and demons alike. It pairs well with Undying for your humans, and for your demons, having that extra magic resistance really does help them against banishment. So it's a win-win situation either way. Blood Bond can be a good one to take earlier on to help you expand, but I actually kind of dislike it. Because all of your sacred souls share damage, that means that your demons and humans, if they're together in range, your human sacreds will actually start to take damage from banishment as well, so do bear that in mind. Just purely because the damage from banishment will start to spill over onto them because they're within the AoE of Blood Bond. Additionally, if you have access to magic weapons and your god is either awake or dormant, something like magic weapons isn't a bad shout. Because of your vast number of sacreds, magic weapons actually can make enemy thugs relying on magical defenses, things like Mist Form, basically useless against your armies. On top of this, the usual great army buff like Fog Warriors or Stygian Rains are not going to be useful against your armies of sacreds. If you do summon a Tlaloque of the West, and they're able to cast Stygian Rains for yourself in battle, this in combination with magic weapons is actually a really nasty combo. Okay, let's show off some pretender examples just so you get an idea of what you could potentially do. The good thing about Mictlan is because your bless is so varied, you can have a bunch of pretender options, and obviously pick what you think is fun. So for our first one, we have the Awake Expander Titan. This is a potential expander to help you take as much territory as you can in the first year. You have an okay bless with an incarnate, which is fine because you're awake from the beginning. The Barkskin will give your troops some immediate natural protection. Then Blood Surge for some additional bonuses after killing an enemy. You also have poison weapons so that when they hit, they do a little bit of damage, and for multi-attackers, that's really quite useful, as well as some extra strength for another little bit of damage. Your scales aren't great, but they're not the worst either, and you could actually go further into a sort of Hellbless if you wanted to make your Pretender even stronger. The TTOA Nan is a nice chassis, especially for expansion, as she has decent protection inbuilt from her necklace, combined with bark skin and also the additional natural protection from being Earth level 4. She can deal with damage fairly well. If you get some research for personal regeneration or stone skin, then she'll be able to deal even more with independent forces thanks to her fear aura, multiple attacks, and the fact that she brings 2d6 horned serpents with her at the start of every single battle. Next up we have an Awake Lich, another immortal expander to help out. Not quite as early as our Titan before, but they can also help you out with research a little bit more beforehand. Stygian Flesh will help out your early expansion for your Sacreds, as well as the Undying and Enchanted Blood effect, in order to regen up with Undying after the battle. On top of this, you have a little bit of extra strength to help you too. For your Lich, unfortunately Stygian Flesh doesn't stack with his inbuilt invulnerability, but you should have enough inbuilt invulnerability at 25 to deal with most independent attacks for a while. You can take him with a couple of Eagle Warriors, and he shouldn't have to hold out for too long for the Eagles to kill all of the enemy commanders. Your scales again aren't too bad, but you could take them worse for a stronger Pretender. Next up we have a fairly wide Dormant Pretender. It's not quite as strong a bless as an Imprisoned Pretender, but this will be able to come out and help with sight searching, researching or casting rituals after the first year. This bless doesn't have any defensive blesses other than the small amount of regen that you get and obviously Undying. But it is actually quite killy through Blood Surge and poison weapons, as well as the increased attack skill that you get. And again, your scales aren't too bad, and should your Sacred survive, they've also got a little bit of heroism that'll improve their stats a little bit too. As an idea for an Awake Hellbless, we have this Fountain of Blood. Again, we're using Enchanted Blood Undying, because I personally quite like that combo, with additional Blood Surge and attack skill that will help your Sacreds become very killy. The lack of a defensive bless should hopefully be offset by Vampiric Weapons, which will life drain your enemies that your Sacreds are fighting. This is very effective on multi-attack Sacreds. Your scales are pretty awful, but that's the cost of taking an Awake Hellbless. With an Awake Pretender, at least they'll be able to help research at the start of the game to get you ahead of the game that way. And hopefully you can use that momentum to win your first war. Finally, for an Imprisoned Hell stat bless, we have Johnny Hellbless. This is a very hard bless. A bunch of resistances for your Sacreds for later in the game, a whole bunch of plus strength and plus attack skill with Blood Surge for your killy Sacreds, which again goes quite well with poison weapons, and then some defense from Undying and Enchanted Blood. Your resistances will hopefully also help out a little bit when it comes to killing enemy mages when battlefield wipes are starting to come out. Your scales are terrible, unfortunately, and your god will come out very, very late, so try and use your Sacreds to your advantage as much as you can to take as many provinces as you can early and surprise someone with an early war. Early Age Mictlan is a great nation to play to get used to a blood economy and using blood slaves, as well as getting used to Sabbaths and communions and having a lot of fun with ridiculous blesses on lots of Sacred units. I would fully recommend you try them out. If you've enjoyed this overview, please let me know in the comments, and if you really like what I do, consider becoming a member for more choices for the upcoming videos, as well as other benefits. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.